Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, April 3rd, 2008. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. Well, this week we head way down south to Australia as we talk to Matt Kirkegaard, editor of Beer and Brewer Magazine. Matt attended the hop harvest in Tasmania recently, and he got an interview with a hop grower in the field about the state of this season's crop. We also get Matt's take on the beer and brewing culture in his part of the world. Well, if you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. Well, up in this hemisphere, our hops are just coming up to begin the season, or at least here in Arkansas they are. And as promised, I posted a Basic Brewing video episode earlier this week that featured the innovative hop trellis design of Andy Sparks of thehomebrewery.com. Andy showed a little bit more imagination than I did in building his hop yard, and we get to see how his design makes stringing the trellises a breeze. And you can check that out in Flash, by the way, on basicbrewingvideo.com if you don't want to download the bigger MP4 file or subscribe via iTunes. And I hope that works better for those of you who have slower internet connections. I've already received a couple of email responses to the episode. Jeff from Kenosha, Wisconsin writes, what kind of wire / twine / etc. do you use or have heard of using for your hops? Well, this year Andy went to the hardware store and basically bought rope. It was similar in dimension to the line that came with his hop rhizomes last year. I personally use a plastic twine-like line, I don't know how you describe it, for my hops, that my buddy, the hay farmer, uses to tie his hay bales. I think the most important thing is that whatever you use is strong enough to support the weight of the hops, especially when it gets windy, and it does get windy around here. And also, it should have some sort of texture that your hops can cling on to as they climb. So I don't think there's anything that is required that you use as a string for your hop trellises. Roger from Lafayette, Colorado writes with this, you know the extra hop shoots that you prune off in the spring can be eaten like mini asparagus. Sounds like a food podcast to me, says Roger. Well, yes, I've heard of that, Roger. In fact, Andy and I were talking about that when we were shooting the footage for the episode. Now, I haven't tried it myself, but it sounds very tasty. Andy says it is kind of like asparagus. Now, imagine there are a lot of things that would taste good if you sauteed them in butter or olive oil. So I've already pruned my cascades back, but I haven't done my Hallertau yet, so I may have to try that. By the way, for those of you who are interested, my East Kent Goldings are finally peeking out of the ground, so maybe they're not lost after all. And there was a point that we didn't talk about in the video podcast, in that you do have to trim back your hops, or at least it's recommended that you do so. And some say that you prune all but 3 of the hop bines coming up and train them up so that, most of the energy of the plant goes into those 3 instead of dozens or however many that would come up naturally. So you really have to be aggressive in pruning those. I don't have the nerve to do all the way down to 3. I use 5, and I get good results. So that's just a little tip. Norm from Linwood, Washington writes this about hops. He says, in your last podcast, you seem to be a little uncomfortable referring to whole hops as leaf hops or whole leaf hops. Norm says, I believe that it is perfectly acceptable because the hop flower is a cone made of bracts with the actual flowers inside the cone. In botany, a bract is a modified or specialized leaf. Norm says bracts are ordinarily associated with reproductive structures, subtending flowers, inflorescence axes, or cone scales. For this reason, calling them leaf hops or whole leaf hops is the most accurate description. Thank you, Norm. It's interesting. Yeah, I've been busted a couple times for people saying when I've said whole leaf hops. in the past. So maybe they are whole leaf hops. It's cool to know there is a scientific reasoning to call them whole leaf. But, to keep everybody happy in the future, though, I may just stick to calling them whole hops instead of whole flower or whole leaf, just so we don't stir the water. Jonathan from Tempe, Arizona, heard me talking about pecans and maple syrup in the previous show. And he writes, I had waffles when I was visiting my parents a few months ago, and they had this maple syrup that had pecans right in the syrup bottle. This, of course, got my brewing gears turning. I took an English brown ale recipe and decided to amp it up with some porter ingredients that I dry hopped with fresh toasted pecans. I guess it'd be dry nutted. Jonathan said it turns out beautifully. The maple syrup was added directly to the secondary. No sanitization is required when pouring straight out of the bottle, as it is already sanitized in there, according to Sam Calagione, I believe, Jonathan says. So that was the way I went, and it turned out really well. It had a strong banana nut bread smell and tastes wonderful. I've gotten many pale ale only people to rave about it. That sounds great, Jonathan. I wonder what a Hefeweizen would taste like with some pecans and maple syrup in it. Shane from Chicago has a good suggestion. Shane says, just thought I'd shoot you a show suggestion. I think it's our patriotic duty as homebrewing Americans to help the economy by spending our stimulus checks on brewing supplies. What extravagant purchases can we make for $600 or less for the betterment of the economy and maybe our hobby too? I plan on biting the bullet and doing my part by finally going to a kegging system. Now there's a fine American, and we could all follow his. We should all follow his example there and step up for our country and also step up our brewing system as well. Finally, from the mailbag at least, Phil from Tallahassee, Florida writes, I just finished my first all-grain batch. Congratulations, Phil. It also happened to be my first small batch. 2 gallons. My mini 2-gallon cooler was a success at holding a constant temperature. That's good news. Also, no stuck sparging. Also, it wasn't hard to convert from 5 gallons to 2 gallons and hit my target gravity almost exactly. Phil says the listeners may be interested in knowing that taking a 1-gallon jug of store-bought spring water can be used to make a fly sparging system. And here's the instructions that Phil gives for doing that. He says, first, cut off the top of a plastic gallon jug, but keep the handle. Poke many small holes in the bottom of the gallon jug using whatever you can get your hands on. I would assume whatever you got your hands on would have to be sharp, though. One caveat there. Next, cut a metal or plastic hanger into 10-inch pieces or larger than the diameter of the 2-gallon cooler. Poke each metal hanger through the gallon jug, intersecting each 10-inch piece at 90-degree angles. This should be done about 3 inches from the bottom of the jug. Control the flow of sparge water into the gallon jug, which sits on top of the 2-gallon Rubbermaid cooler, and try to make the sparging last at least 30 minutes. And the brewer should notice a slight trickle from the many holes, creating a great sparge system. Well, thanks, Phil. I think that could fit under the heading of recycling as well. Well, before we get into this week's interview, I want to give a shout-out to Douglas Wierzinski, who you may remember was on this show when we were talking about the legislation that was trying to legalize homebrewing in Utah. Douglas came on the show to talk about that. Well, Douglas has launched a podcast called Homebrewing Perspectives at homebrewingperspectives.com. And the first episode was a little rough because of some technical issues, but the second episode is solid, and Douglas appears to be on the right track, and I wish him well. When you get a chance, you should check it out. homebrewingperspectives.com. Okay, Matt Kirkegaard is the editor of Beer and Brewer Magazine, which originates in Australia, and is a beautiful magazine, by the way. Matt contacted me recently to see if I would be interested in hearing about the hop harvest in Tasmania, because he was heading down there to cover it, and I said, yes, of course. These days with the hop situation the way it is, I'm especially interested in hearing how the harvest is shaping up around the world, since we're all connected. And I talked to Matt about hops and the beer culture in his part of the world. Well, Matt Kirkegaard, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thank you very much, James.
Now, you are the editor of Beer and Brewer Magazine, and where are you right now?
I'm in Brisbane, which is in Queensland in Australia.
Now, I'll have to get out my map and find out where exactly you are. Where are you on the continent of Australia?
On the east coast. We're the northernmost state on the east coast, and I guess US listeners would probably know of the Great Barrier Reef, which is right offshore down much of our coastline.
I hear it's a pretty country.
It is, and very, very big, much like your own.
Since it's so far away, we hardly get a sense of the scale, and what we see of Australia is unfortunately probably a bastardized version of your culture, such as the Crocodile Dundee, and we have the Outback Steakhouses, and we have Foster's, which is said to be Australian for beer, and a lot of us that's about all we know.
And I think in a lot of ways we have a similarly jaundiced view of the United States, that pretty much everything that you guys drink is Bud Light. You all eat enormous hamburgers and drive enormous SUVs. So I think those sorts of cultural impressions sort of flow both ways.
Well, yours is probably more accurate than ours, I think.
Well, I was going to say that the impressions that you've got are probably just exaggerated views of what's there, as opposed to completely false views.
I think that the bud drinking, SUV drivers who are eating hamburgers as they drive are probably outnumbering all the rest of those who try to characterize themselves otherwise. But
oh, well, the US is leading the world in craft brewing at the moment, so we're certainly looking to you for that lead, which is a good thing.
Well, there is that. So tell me about the beer culture down there. What do we not know about Australian beer culture, both on the commercial side and the home brewing side as well?
Well, you've mentioned Foster's, and there are two big brewers in Australia, much like your big three, and for a long period they've dominated the market. But over the last 5 or 6 years, there has been a real upswing in the number of what we call boutique breweries or craft breweries or microbreweries, and they've been brewing some terrific beers. And last week I was down at the Australian International Beer Awards in Melbourne, which was very interesting because for the first time I got to try some of the great American beers I'd heard about, such as Stone's Imperial Stout. Mm-hmm. That was on the menu there, and it was great to finally get a chance to try some of your great beers, or your very good beers, and compare them to some of our own. And I have to say that it was good to see that the advances that our craft brewers have made seems to really compare very well with the great beers that we regularly hear about coming from the US.
Well, good. It sounds like you're keeping up with this then.
Well, I think we're a few years behind you, and we're coming off a much lower base. I remember speaking to the Brewers Association recently, and I think you got down to as low as around about 100 breweries at one stage, but you're now well over 1,400 breweries. I think Australia's got roughly 120 at the moment, scattered across a similar geographic area. So we've still got a long way to go, but we certainly are showing some very, very positive signs.
Now, I know that there is a very strong home brewer community down there, because I get quite a lot of mail from your part of the world. From what you've heard about the United States home brewing movement, do you think that our cultures on the home brewing side are somewhat similar?
I think that's where our cultures are probably the most similar. Australia has always had a very strong home brewing community. And in fact, Cooper's is an Australian brewery that was one of the pioneers of the malt extracts that really allowed for the expansion of the industry in the 1970s. But we've also got a very, very strong all-grain brewing industry. And recently you spoke to you spoke to John
Palmer.
John Palmer, and he's coming down with Jamil for what I gather is our first national homebrew conference. So the homebrewing industry has always been strong, but I don't think it's ever really come together the way that the US industry seems to have done under your Brewers Association, and that's a really great sign for our local industry.
Well, I think it's exciting. I love corresponding with homebrewers all around the world because, I think that by using the internet through message boards and podcasts and what have you, I think that this is an opportunity for us to expand our hobby exponentially, learning from each other's work and learning from publications along the way, such as yours.
And I think I've written in the magazine before when I've reviewed your podcast that these sorts of things are what I really think is the strength and the joy of the internet, is that we can talk across the world and exchange ideas very, very easily. And I'd like to congratulate you on everything you've done with your podcast. I've been enjoying it now for 2 or 3 years, and I think it's fantastic what you've achieved. And there really should be more of it. And gradually, Australians are starting to pick up on the technology and see the way that technology can help their brewing as well.
Well, thank you. I can't. All the credit goes to my guests, I'm afraid. I'm just a conduit.
Oh, well, your enthusiasm comes out very, very clearly, and I think that's one of the things that really carries people along, is the enthusiasm with which homebrewers tend to their craft.
Well, I was very excited to get a copy of your magazine, and I hope to get more as time goes on. It's a beautiful publication and well put together, and I want to congratulate you on that as well. Tell us about your publication, Beer and Brewer Magazine. It's not only about commercial beers, it also has a strong home brewer section in there as well.
Well, thanks for that, James. I guess my frustration for years has been that any interest that people have had has been well served by magazines, and I think possibly because of the size of the Australian market, beer magazines, for the popularity of beer, haven't really flourished. And the publisher of Beer and Brewer launched it. We're just about to have the first anniversary edition, and it seems to be going very, very well. But we've really targeted beer lovers and the broader, looking at beer culture quite broadly, rather than targeting a particular niche. And I think that reflects the interests that people that really enjoy good beer have. We're a fairly eclectic bunch, and there is a lot to say about beer that's not necessarily just about home brewing or commercial brands or craft brewing, but beer certainly infects in a nice way Australian culture and influences so much of it that there is a lot to write about. So it's a joy to be a part of.
And I noticed that the title of your home brewing section is homebrew. It's not craft brewer.
No, well, home brewing is done at home. We generally take the craft brew epithet for commercial small-scale brewers, and home brewing has been something that's just synonymous with guys tending to their fermentation vessels at home, and it's the best name for it. Although with our homebrew section, we also take it a little bit more broadly to look at commercial brewing and looking at some of the more practical elements of brewing, both to inspire homebrewers and to educate them. We find that a lot of our homebrewers dream one day of having a microbrewery or a craft brewery, and so we're trying to give them the information that they need to take that next step when they feel that they're ready.
Now, I say that in a way to poke fun a little bit, because we had a big discussion, was it last year or year before, on what people all around the world call themselves, and there's certain component of your part of the world who calls themselves craft brewers. And, Graham Sanders would be probably the most vocal one of those.
Yes, and I think the names can be used interchangeably, but I think there is still a very strong egalitarian aspect of Australians, that they don't want to make it sound too lofty a title, and I think a lot of them let others call their beers craft brews as opposed to calling them home brews themselves, just so they don't get... Australians are very good knockers if anyone seems to be getting too far ahead of themselves, and I think perhaps they let others call their beers craft brews rather than home brews.
The culture is you don't want to get too big for your britches then.
Exactly. It's called here the tall poppy syndrome, where the tall poppy is the one that gets plucked.
Well, speaking of plucking and picking, if I can make a tortured transition there.
I thought that was a terrific segue.
You made a trip recently to Tasmania to attend the hop harvest down there. Is Tasmania the main region where hops are grown in your part of the world?
Tasmania is the main region, and they've got a very long history of hop growing. I think it's the oldest hop growing region in Australia. There is another concentration in Victoria, which is just over the Bass Strait. Tasmania is the island that hangs off the southern end, although I'll probably get in trouble for saying that. Tasmanians are very protective about themselves. It hangs off the southern coast of the Australian continent, and Victoria is just over the Bass Strait. So they're the two main regions of hop growing over here.
And you had a conversation with, is it Tim Lord of Hop Products Australia?
That's correct. Tim is the General Manager of Hop Products Australia, and he very kindly took us around their hop fields and gave us a very interesting tour. A lot of it was unfortunately conducted in the processing sheds, which didn't make for very good radio. Otherwise, I would have shared some of that with you. But we were guests of the Cascade Brewery there as well, because Cascade Brewery is Australia's oldest working brewery. It's 180 years old, and they're owned by the Foster's group of companies, which you would have already mentioned. And every year they're just up the road, essentially, from the hop fields, and every year they brew a first harvest ale, and we were down to watch them select and pick the hops for that, and then the following day we made a very fresh batch of freshly hopped beer, which was great to see.
Well, let's listen to your conversation with Tim.
Well, James, I'm here at Bushy Park in Tasmania. Bushy Park is about 45 minutes up the Derwent Valley from the Tasmanian capital of Hobart, and I'm watching the start of the 2008 Tasmanian hop harvest. What you just heard was the tractor running down the rows of hops with a scissor mechanism at the front that cuts the bines at the base, and in a little while we'll have the harvesters coming down and doing much the same, cutting the top of the hop vines and loading them onto a wagon to take in for processing. I'm watching this with Tim Lord, Managing Director of Hop Products Australia, Australia's largest producer of hops. Tim, there has been a lot of interest around the world about the hop shortage and the price of hops, but things seem to be looking pretty good here at Bushy Park. Has it been a good season?
Well, we've been pretty lucky actually. We have had a pretty good season. It has been rather dry. We would have liked a little more rain, particularly down in this part of the world, here in southern Tasmania. Having said which, our location here means that we have ample water from the Derwent River and the Styx River. So whilst we actually had one of the driest Januaries on record, the temperatures were high and we had ample water. So we've actually had a reasonably good growing season.
Did you increase your planting this year or increase your production this year compared to last year?
We've increased it significantly again this year. I guess around 2006, 2005, 2006 was probably the lowest, the least amount of hops were grown in Australia for a decade or more. Since then, we've increased production quite significantly. This year, we're probably 50% up on those numbers from 2005, and we're still putting more in. So we've increased production here from around 850 acres up to about 1,500 acres. So it's a pretty significant increase for us.
And how easy is it to increase your production over that sort of period? Is there much infrastructure involved?
Well, as you can see, as we stand here in the hop garden, the infrastructure that you require, the trellis, poles, wire, etc., is quite expensive. When you couple irrigation to that, it costs a lot of money to build something like this. The difficulty really is having the specialised picking and kilning equipment that you need to process the hops. It's all good and well to put some trellis up like this, but you really need to be able to harvest and handle it. And that's where most of the world limitation is at this point in time.
What are the forecasts like for the international hop harvest at this stage? Do you keep in touch with the international scene?
Well, I do. Hop Products Australia is part of the global Bath Haas group, which encompasses Joe Bath in Germany, John I. Haas in North America, and Botanics in the UK. So we're really the southern hemisphere part of the group. Being 6 months out, it's spring's just breaking in the northern hemisphere, so it's very, very early days yet. There's very high hopes for a good harvest this year because as most people who have some understanding of the industry know, basically the world ran out of hops in about 2005. Something that's taken quite a long time for the brewing community to really understand and for the full ramification to be understood. So the world still remains short. This year's harvest here is fully sold, and in fact our next year's harvest 2009 is fully sold. All the crops out of North America and Europe coming up for harvest in September, October this year are all fully sold, and so everyone's got their fingers crossed that there'll be some good hop crops in the next few years.
It's certainly great conditions to be a hop grower, not so great if you're a brewer. What percentage of your hops is used domestically and what percentage is exported?
Well, as it stands today, we supply the bulk of the hops that go into the domestic brewing here in Australia, so that covers most of the major brands that people may be aware of in Australia. But we export this year we'll be exporting about 80% of our production, which is something that people are not normally aware of. They often think of this business as supplying predominantly just the Australian market, but we're now sending hops to North America and Europe, and expanding quite quickly in Asia into places like Thailand and China, Vietnam, India, a number of places like that. So these hops are travelling the world, and a proportion of them go for Australian beer that's brewed overseas, your Fosters and your 4X and things of this nature, but increasingly going to brewers' own brands in overseas countries.
And what varieties are going to the United States particularly?
The United States takes typically one of our very high alpha varieties. From our breeding efforts, we have a variety called Topaz, which is one of the highest alpha yielding varieties in the world. And this particular hop goes for extraction, for making of liquid hop products, or CO2 extract as it's called. And there's a couple of things which are quite unique to that particular variety, which make it very, very suitable for this downstream processing. So that's the bulk of the shipment to North America.
And how about aromatic varieties? Do you send many aromatic varieties, such as Cascade, back to the States?
We're sending a little bit of Cascade back to the States for use outside of brewing. Aromatics is something that we're really expanding into at this stage. Our breeding program in years gone by has focused primarily on high alpha varieties, and as our farms get bigger, we need hops that mature a little earlier and a little later. And also with some of the issues with getting supply particularly from Europe, we're seeing a lot of brewers interested in securing aroma hops from the southern hemisphere. So our breeding focus and our farm expansion plans now incorporate a number of aroma varieties, which we've primarily bred here, and we're seeing a lot of interest in that area now. So we're planning more, and that's where a lot of the expansion is going to be here. The incremental expansion that we undertake in the next couple of years will probably be in those areas.
We've seen a variety called Galaxy being processed this morning. That was an amazing aromatic hop, very passion fruit, and I got some orange coming from that. That's only a new variety that's been developed and used for the first time commercially this year. Is that correct?
Yes, really it's just been the subject of some experimental brewing at this stage. We're putting a lot more effort into having all our varieties trial brewed and assessed for sensory evaluation before we really take a step and releasing them commercially. The Galaxy is a very interesting hop which traces back. It's quite high in alpha as well as having an exquisite aroma. And it traces back to the Pride of Ringwood variety, but it's also crossed with a German variety Perla, and it just comes out with this extraordinary, as you said, passion fruit and summer fruit sort of aroma. It's very pleasant.
Tim Lord, thank you very much for your time. Well, James, that's a quick look at the hop season down under. Sounds like things have been going fairly well, with increased acreage under cultivation and good yield and good growing conditions. Hopefully, as the northern spring and summer roll round, you'll have similarly good conditions, and hops will be much easier to come by and much cheaper for home brewers everywhere. Now, we've got a harvester about to descend upon us, so if you'll pardon the pun, we'd better hop out of the way.
So that had to be really interesting, being there as the hops were harvested. Was that your first trip to a hop farm?
It was my first trip, and it was fascinating to see how they did it, and particularly, as I'd mentioned, the Cascade Harvest Ale. And without wanting to run an ad for them, it was very interesting to see that they really talk up the first harvest aspects and the handmade, which a lot of even the big brewers tend to talk about, but they really did. They actually hand-picked the hops for their specialty beer and processed them on a completely separate line, and it was fascinating to see that some of the marketing hype that you often hear about was actually lived up to.
Well, that's interesting. So they actually had people on the line picking them by hand and not a machine.
Picking them by hand, and one thing that they'd not mentioned, and just to steer away from hops for a second, they also malt their own beer, their own barley as well, and use their first harvest barley for it as well. So it was a fascinating thing to see. But the hops particularly, having seen hops planted previously, I'd never seen the other end, and they're an amazing plant when you see them up close.
Yeah, I just spent a little bit of time on my Cascades this afternoon, stringing up the first eager vine as it's was reaching toward the strings. So this is my third season of raising hops at home, and it is a fascinating plant. They just grow so tall and so fast. It's just amazing.
Now, I'm not sure how you keep the weeds down around the base of your hops, but I'm told sheep are very good at that. At Bushy Park, where the hops are grown in Tasmania, they run several thousand head of sheep through their plantations, and sheep seem to not be put off by the very bitter leaves and shoots. And once the hop vines have got to a certain height, they run the sheep through to graze on the understory and keep the weeds down, and also strip the lowest couple of inches of leaves. So it was a fascinating experience to hear some of these production methods.
And they may fertilize the crops as they go by.
And they fertilise the crop, and they don't compact the soil as well, because they're much smaller than running tractors along.
Now, are you home brewers down there? Are you as affected by the hop shortage as we are up here?
We don't seem to have been. It hasn't been such a hot topic as it has, from what I've gathered from your podcast. And I think one of the reasons for that is Australia is a very small market. We're a small producer of hops, but also a fairly small consumer of hops as well. And because of that, I think a lot of our hop distributors and a lot of our brewers have relied on forward contracts, which has meant that we've bought a lot of our hops in advance, whereas some of the bigger producers and some of the bigger purchasers have relied on spot contracts. And as the hop price has gone up, they've had to buy at the prevailing market conditions, whereas a lot of our brewers and a lot of our small home brewery suppliers have been able to take advantage of these hop contracts that were signed when the hop price was still quite good. Now, with the joys of the internet and the ability to communicate, we've had a lot of home brewers and even small breweries in the United States buying from our online homebrew suppliers. And I was speaking to one fellow yesterday from craftbrewer.com, and he's recently sent some large consignments of hops over to homebrew clubs in the States, as well as some of the smaller craft brewers. So that was fairly interesting because he was able to sell them, I think the spot price or the purchasing price for some of these was around about $20 for 100 grams. He was able to sell it for $7 for 100 grams, including $1 postage, or with $1 postage added on. So it's a sort of much cheaper price for the hops that he's able to supply.
Well, you're having said that, you might have passed the word on to enough homebrewers up here that you might have emptied your supply of hops for the next year.
I think he'll look after his local market, but he certainly, I think he carries 50-odd varieties of hops, and so he's able to supply them very fresh and very well. Again, not meaning to run an ad for our local producers or our local retailers, but he was very interesting to speak to about the relative hop prices and the reasons for them.
And it sounds like that at least Tim's company has had a good year, and it sounds like that they are upping their production. And he said that they're exporting 80% of their production. So is that good news for brewers in the United States and particularly, to be selfish, home brewers in the United States? Do you think that a bumper crop in your part of the world can make an impact on our situation up here?
I think, as I said, we're quite small producers, so it's not as if we'll be able to single-handedly supply America's enormous need or the shortfall. But I think what Australia shows at the moment is that with the price the way that they is, there is certainly a return for producers, and hopefully it will encourage more producers to put more acreage under hops, whereas for the last 3 or 4 years there's been quite a significant decline in production. So that is very positive, although as Tim said, there is a real lag time in how you can increase your production because there is so much infrastructure involved, and even then the processing sheds are the real bottleneck. And when you walk through one of these processing sheds and you see the production lines, you realise how much is involved in harvesting and drying and packaging the hops. And if there's not it's a significant block of infrastructure to put in if the prices aren't going to stay high or if demand isn't going to stay at the level that it currently is. So I guess we're very small producers, but we are indicative of what's happening globally in terms of gradually increasing supply.
Now, give us a walkthrough of the process. You've got these. How tall are they? 20 feet tall hop binds on the trellises. How do they get them from there into the packages?
Well, you heard the interview where we were very close to the tractors that have the scissor cutters out the front, and they proceed down the line with the scissor cutters cutting the binds and the coir ropes that they're grown on at the bottom. And then not long after that, a second harvester, much the same but 20 feet higher, comes along and cuts the binds at the top. And then they're laid very carefully over the back of a harvest wagon so that when they're taken to the, I guess, the stripping sheds, one end is put into a conveyor situation, and then a series of rubber fingers runs down and strips the leaves and the flowers off the vine, and then they're separated through mechanical means, and the hops are taken off for drying to a drying rack. So it's remarkably quick. It's a remarkably quick process, and I have to tell you, James, the smell when we were in there was, you really couldn't wait to your end of day beer when you're going through there with the incredible aromas that were coming off these beds of drying hops. But it was a fascinating process to see, and very quick, and particularly when you realise that the harvesting season is only 2 or 3 weeks, and the amounts or the volumes that they're processing over that period. I took quite a lot of photos that I'll be using in the magazine, but I can put those on a Picasa or a Flickr account, so some of your listeners can see it, because it's an astounding process, and certainly for anyone that's got an interest in beer or brewing, it's always interesting to see where the raw materials come from.
Yeah, I'd be glad to put a link to that in the description of this episode on basicbrewingradio.com. So, I'm always interested in the back, behind the scenes of how the big boys do it. So that would be wonderful. Well, I certainly appreciate your time, and I hope that we can get together again, maybe even on a regular basis, to get reports from your part of the world and get your perspective on beer and brewing down there.
I'd love to be a part of the show, and there's certainly a lot happening, and anything that we can do to sort of cross-pollinate ideas. And I'll certainly, I think the Cascade Brewery will be sending me a few bottles of their first harvest ale, so I'll make sure I send you at least one bottle so you can share the adventure.
Oh, I would be pleased to sample that for you and give you some feedback from an American perspective.
That would be terrific to hear what you think of it. Having had the opportunity to, I didn't mention earlier, we got the chance to empty the fresh hop flowers into the kettle as part of the hopping process, and so I actually claim the beer as my own this time, and I'll be looking for a royalty check from the brewery.
Or at least more beers.
That would be fine.
Well, Matt, thank you very much for your time. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you very much, James.
Well, thanks again to Matt Kirkegaard of Beer and Brewer Magazine. I hope we'll be hearing more from him in the future. You can visit Beer and Brewer at beerandbrewer.com. Well, next week, our chemistry professor buddy Brad Sturgeon of Monmouth College joins us to investigate what causes skunking and whether the color of your bottles really makes a difference. Here's a hint. It does. Well, if you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com, and please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And you can check out our low-tech lagering and decoction mashing DVD on our website, where you can see Steve Wilkes do a single-step decoction mash, and you can follow me through a lager fermentation in the middle of summertime, where I don't use a dedicated chest freezer. There are also our original DVDs. In Basic Brewing Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, we walk you through the extract brewing process step by step from boiling to bottling. And in Basic Brewing Stepping into All Grain, we take you through the all grain process from milling your grain to collecting your wort. We've got combo deals to save you a few bucks if you want to buy more than one DVD at a time. And you can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online in our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. We've also got shirts and hats, including our ever-popular Go Forth and Flocculate shirt. Been sending out a few of those recently. I'm hoping that people are getting those to get their pictures taken in cool places so that we can put them on the gallery on basicbrewing.com. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are preparation of solid catalysts, which must be quite the book, looking at the price tag. Thanks very much for clicking on the Amazon.com link before you bought that. That's great. And Hasbro Play School Busy Ball Popper. Was it? That wasn't that funny until I read it just then. I'm sorry. Keep that away from me, the Busy Ball Popper. Thanks again, everybody, and remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We appreciate your support. That's all till next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. He's down in Austin. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.